Welcome to U.S. Watch Truth. Tonight at the Strait of Hormuz, where the Persian Gulf narrows to its most strategically decisive bottleneck, and where the presence of American naval power has for decades communicated the unspoken but universally understood message that the waters of the Gulf operate under American rules at 4:92 a.m. 890 missiles of two distinct and devastatingly complementary hypersonic classes lifted from their launch platforms across the southwestern Iranian coastline in a coordinated departure sequence spanning less than 5 minutes that generated a combined radar and infrared signature so massive, so geometrically overwhelming, and so immediately and unambiguously lethal in its implications that the battle management systems of the USS Gerald Ford carrier strike group completed their automated threat classification and highest priority alert activation before the officers in the carrier's combat information center had fully registered the scale of what their instruments were telling them. The USS Gerald Ford, CVN 78, the lead ship of the United States Navy's newest and most technologically advanced carrier class, representing the most significant investment in naval aviation capability in American history, a platform whose construction cost exceeded $13 billion and whose total program cost, including development, represents the single largest shipbuilding investment any nation has ever made in a single vessel. The Gerald Ford was not deployed to the Strait of Hormuz to participate in a military engagement. It was deployed to prevent one. Its presence was the argument. Its combat air wing of 90 aircraft, its advanced weapons, elevators, its electromagnetic launch systems, its dual nuclear reactors, generating power sufficient to electrify a medium-sized city, and the strike group of Aegis cruisers and destroyers surrounding it were the physical embodiment of the American strategic proposition that the cost of challenging American interests at Hormuz was a cost no rational adversary would choose to pay. At 4:52 a.m., Iran demonstrated that it had assessed this proposition, studied it in exhaustive technical detail across years of intelligence collection against American naval systems, identified its specific vulnerabilities with a precision that the proposition's architects never anticipated, and prepared the operational response that would test it against reality in the most definitive way available. 890 hypersonic missiles, 530 Fattah-4 boost glide hypersonic vehicles traveling at terminal velocities, approaching Mach 20, carrying shaped charge penetrating warheads specifically engineered for the defeat of Gerald Ford-class carrier deck construction, 360 Zircon scramjet-powered hypersonic anti-ship missiles, weapons whose sustained Mach 9 cruise speed in the terminal phase and whose active radar terminal seeker provide a targeting precision that does not degrade in the electronically contested environment that Iran simultaneously created around the strike group. Two weapon systems whose individual capabilities are formidable and whose combined deployment created an engagement problem that the Gerald Ford's defensive architecture could not solve within the 11 minutes available before the last warhead impacted. 11 minutes and 43 seconds after the first Fattah-4 reached terminal phase, the USS Gerald Ford was gone. Not damaged, not mission killed while remaining afloat. Gone. Its flight deck destroyed across every section. Its island superstructure eliminated, its nuclear reactors in emergency shutdown, its aviation fuel generating fires that damage control teams were fighting and losing simultaneously across 6 separate deck levels. The most technologically advanced aircraft carrier ever built by any nation at any point in human history had been sunk at the Strait of Hormuz by Iranian hypersonic missiles in less time than it takes to conduct a standard flight. Operations briefing, and the ships of the United States Fifth Fleet, the cruisers and destroyers that had survived the strike with their defensive magazines exhausted and their damage control teams overwhelmed, were accelerating to maximum speed on headings that pointed away from Iranian weapons range, away from the burning wreckage of the Gerald Ford, and away from the Strait of Hormuz that they had occupied as an expression of American dominance. And were now fleeing as survivors of the most devastating single engagement in American naval history since Pearl Harbor. The Fifth Fleet is fleeing, the Gerald Ford is sunk. And at US Watch Truth, we will tell you exactly what happened, exactly why it happened, and exactly what it means for the world you live in. This is US Watch Truth. Stay with us. 4 questions will drive everything in tonight's analysis. How did Iran engineer the specific combination of Fattah-4 and Zircon hypersonic systems into a strike architecture that defeated the Gerald Ford's most advanced defensive capabilities in 11 minutes and 43 seconds? And what does the operational precision of this two-system kill chain reveal about the depth of Iranian anti-carrier doctrine that American naval planners had failed to model accurately? What made the Gerald Ford specifically vulnerable to this attack despite representing the most advanced carrier defensive technology in the world? And why did the technological innovations that distinguish the Ford class from its predecessors provide less defensive advantage than their cost and complexity promised? What drove the Fifth Fleet's decision to flee rather than remain in the engagement zone? And what does the speed and completeness of that flight communicate to every Navy and every government watching about the new operational realities at the Strait of Hormuz? And what does the sinking of the Gerald Ford mean for American naval strategy, the global oil order, the petrodollar, and the accelerating transition to the multipolar world whose arrival the events at Hormuz tonight have made definitively and irreversibly real? Every answer is coming in full depth. Stay with us. US Watch Truth exists to give you the analysis that institutional voices are structured to withhold the operational honesty that official communications are designed to prevent, and the strategic depth that this moment demands from anyone serious about understanding the world as it actually is, rather than as governments prefer to present it. If this channel is delivering that value, show it right now. Hit like, subscribe immediately. Share this video across every platform and network you operate in, and leave your assessment in the comments below. The community this channel is building makes this analysis matter beyond this screen and this moment. We engage with everything our audience produces. Now let us get into the full operational picture of what happened at the Strait of Hormuz at 4:52 a.m. The destruction of the USS Gerald Ford in 11 minutes and 43 seconds was the product of an attack architecture whose design reflected years of dedicated intelligence collection and technical analysis against the specific defensive capabilities and vulnerabilities of Gerald. Ford-class carriers and the Aegis combat systems of their escorting vessels. To understand the strike fully requires understanding not just what Iran did, but why the specific operational choices made in its design were optimally suited to defeating the specific defensive configuration that the Gerald Ford and its Pacific Strike Group presented at 4:52 a.m. The Gerald Ford class was designed with specific improvements over the Nimitz class intended to enhance both offensive capability and defensive survivability. The electromagnetic aircraft launch system replacing steam catapults, the advanced arresting gear replacing the legacy recovery system, the dual-band radar integrating the functions previously performed by separate search and fire control arrays, and critically, from a defensive perspective, the increased electrical power generation capacity intended to support future directed energy weapons and enhanced electronic warfare systems that have not yet been fully fielded. These improvements are genuine and significant, but they were designed against a threat model that did not include the Fattah-4 at Mach 20 combined with the Zircon at Mach 9. And the gap between the threat model against which the Ford's defensive systems were designed and the threat that arrived at 4:52 a.m. is the gap in which the carrier was destroyed. The Iranian intelligence collection operation against the Gerald Ford's specific defensive configuration had been running since the carrier's arrival in the theater. The carrier's dual-band radar electromagnetic emissions had been characterized through electronic intelligence collection that provided detailed information about its search modes, track update rates, and the specific thresholds at which it transitions from surveillance to fire control, tracking against different threat categories. The Aegis systems of the escorting cruiser and destroyers had been similarly characterized. The interceptor inventory status of each escorting vessel had been estimated through signals intelligence analysis of engagement data from preceding operations in the theater, and the Gerald Ford's position within the strait, combined with the specific geometric constraints imposed by the strait's narrow width, had been analyzed to identify the approach vectors that would force the defensive systems into their most constrained engagement geometries. The result of this collection effort was a targeting and attack planning picture of sufficient detail to design a strike package specifically optimized against the Gerald Ford's actual defensive configuration rather than a generic carrier strike group. The specific proportions of Fattah-4 and Zircon in the strike package, the specific approach vectors assigned to each system, and the specific timing of the electronic warfare activation relative to the missile launches were all determined by analysis of the Gerald Ford's specific characteristics rather than generic carrier vulnerability assessment. The strike began with two simultaneous actions initiated at exactly 4:52 a.m. The first was the activation of an Iranian electronic warfare package that had been embedded in the electronic environment of the Strait for 36 hours using the emission signatures of commercial traffic to conceal its presence from American signal monitoring. This package executed a multi-band jamming and spoofing operation against the Gerald Ford's dual-band radar and the SPY-6 arrays of its Aegis escorts, specifically targeting the frequency bands and signal processing modes that these systems use for hypersonic target tracking. The dual-band radar's integration of search and fire control functions into a single system, one of the Ford class's primary innovations, created a specific vulnerability that Iranian electronic warfare planners had identified and exploited. In the Nimitz class, search radar and fire control radar are separate systems that must be separately jammed. In the Ford class, jamming the integrated dual-band radar simultaneously degrades both search and fire control functions. The Iranian electronic warfare package was specifically designed to exploit this integration, targeting the dual-band radar with a jamming profile calibrated to its specific operating parameters in ways that would degrade fire control, tracking confidence against hypersonic targets, while maintaining enough search capability to force the system into active engagement mode. The second simultaneous action was the exploitation of the Strait's geometric constraints. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Iranian launch platforms on the southwestern coastal arc can engage targets at the center of the strait from angles that force the target vessel's defensive systems to engage simultaneous threats arriving from overlapping bearing sectors, a geometric situation that degrades the ability of any defensive system to maintain separate track files and generate independent engagement solutions for multiple simultaneous targets. The 890 missile launch positions were distributed across the Iranian coastal arc to maximize this geometric compression effect, ensuring that the Gerald Ford's defensive systems would be attempting to track targets arriving from sectors that overlap sufficiently to cause track merging and engagement solution conflicts in the battle management software. At 4:52 a.m. and 30 seconds after the electronic warfare package reached full operational effectiveness, the first wave of 220 Zircon missiles entered the outer engagement envelope of the Gerald Ford strike group. The Zircon was selected as the first wave weapon for reasons that parallel the Hajj Qasim selection in earlier Iranian carrier strikes, but that reflect the Zircon's specific technical characteristics and their interaction with the Gerald Ford's particular defensive systems. The Zircon is a scramjet-powered hypersonic cruise missile with a sustained terminal cruise speed of approximately Mach 9 and an active radar terminal seeker that provides continuous self-contained targeting updates throughout. Its terminal phase. Unlike boost glide hypersonic vehicles, whose terminal maneuvers are executed through aerodynamic control surfaces, the Zircon's scramjet propulsion provides sustained thrust through its terminal phase, enabling trajectory modifications that are not limited by the aerodynamic forces available at terminal glide velocities. This powered maneuverability in the terminal phase creates an intercept geometry problem for SM-6 engagements that is different from the geometry presented by glide vehicles, and that requires different engagement solutions, forcing the battle management system to maintain separate engagement solution algorithms for the Zircon tracks simultaneously with the Fattah-4 tracks that would arrive in the second wave. The 220 Zircon missiles of the first wave were assigned approach vectors that maximize the geometric compression effect created by the strait's narrow width, arriving at the outer defensive perimeter from bearing sectors that overlapped with the predicted approach vectors of the Fattah-4 second wave. This overlap was deliberate. It forced the battle management system to manage track files for two different hypersonic threat categories, arriving from partially overlapping bearing sectors, simultaneously creating a cognitive and computational load on the system's engagement management software that degraded its ability to maintain clean track separation and generate reliable engagement solutions for either threat category. Against the 220 Zircon missiles of the first wave, the Gerald Ford strike group expended approximately 310 interceptors across 6 minutes of continuous engagement. The Zircon's active radar terminal seeker maintained targeting accuracy through the degraded electronic environment produced by the Iranian jamming package, achieving a penetration rate of approximately 62% against the interceptor salvo sizes the depleted magazines could generate. 136 Zircon warheads penetrated the defensive envelope. 41 struck the Gerald Ford, with the remaining 95 impacting across the escort vessels. The Gerald Ford's dual-band radar was damaged by 3 direct hits on its antenna arrays. 1 Ticonderoga cruiser was destroyed. 2 Arleigh Burke destroyers were severely damaged, and the combined interceptor inventory of the surviving escort vessels was reduced to approximately 140 rounds. At 4:58 a.m., 6 minutes after the electronic warfare activation and 30 seconds after the last Zircon of the first wave had either been intercepted or impacted, 530 Fattah-4 missiles entered the engagement envelope of a carrier strike group whose defensive capacity had been reduced to 140 interceptors across 3 surviving destroyers and the Gerald Ford's own degraded point defense systems. The Fattah-4's Mach 20 terminal velocity provided the surviving defensive systems with a maximum reaction window of 38 seconds from first detection to impact, reduced by the dual-band radar damage sustained during the Zircon engagement to approximately 22 seconds for the majority of incoming tracks. Against 530 hypersonic missiles arriving from multiple vectors with a 22-second reaction window and 140 interceptors available, the defensive mathematics produced a single possible outcome. 140 interceptors were fired against the degraded tracking picture. Approximately 29 intercepts were achieved. 501 Fattah-4 missiles reached their designated targets. The distribution of the 501 penetrating Fattah-4 warheads was structured according to the targeting architecture established before the launch, with 312 allocated to the Gerald Ford itself and 189 distributed across the surviving escort vessels and the support vessels of the strike group. The Gerald Ford received 312 Fattah-4 warhead impacts across 5 minutes from 4:58 a.m. to 5:03 a.m. The first impacts at 4:58 a.m. destroyed the remaining functional elements of the dual-band radar and the island superstructure. Subsequent impacts penetrated to the hangar deck and the deck below, where aviation fuel storage generated secondary explosions of extraordinary intensity that propagated through the ship's interior faster than damage control teams could respond. The electromagnetic launch system catapult mechanisms were destroyed in the first minute of the Fattah-4 impact sequence. The nuclear reactor compartments entered emergency shutdown at 4:59 a.m. as automated protection systems responded to the progressive structural failure. The carrier began listing at 5:00 a.m. By 5:02 a.m., the list had reached 31 degrees, and the structural integrity of the hull was failing across multiple sections simultaneously. The abandoned ship order was transmitted at 5:02 a.m. and 30 seconds. At 5:03 a.m. and 43 seconds, 11 minutes and 43 seconds after the first electronic warfare activation, the USS Gerald Ford capsized. Attack 4, eliminating the survivors. 5:03 a.m. to 5:08 a.m. The final wave of 140 Zircon missiles arrived at 5:03 a.m. to complete the destruction of every surviving vessel in the Gerald Ford strike group against defensive systems that had been completely exhausted by the preceding engagement. These 140 missiles encountered no meaningful resistance. The surviving Arleigh Burke destroyers, the attack submarines that had been operating in support of the strike group, and the replenishment vessel at the rear of the formation were all engaged and destroyed across 5 minutes of unopposed hypersonic fire. At 5:08 a.m., the Gerald Ford carrier strike group ceased to exist as a military formation. The surviving ships of the broader Fifth Fleet formation, those positioned at sufficient distance from the engagement zone to have avoided direct engagement, were already at maximum speed on headings away from Hormuz. The Fifth Fleet was fleeing. The operational pairing of the Fattah-4 and the Zircon in the Gerald Ford strike reflects a more sophisticated anti-carrier doctrine than the earlier Fattah-4 and Hajj Qasim combination used in preceding engagements, adapted specifically to address the Gerald Ford's distinctive defensive characteristics that differentiate it from Nimitz-class targets. The Zircon scramjet propulsion provides terminal phase performance characteristics that differ from both the Fattah-4's hypersonic glide and the Hajj Qasim's ballistic terminal phase in ways specifically relevant to engagement against the Gerald Ford's dual-band radar. The dual-band radar's integrated design, while providing performance advantages in many operational contexts, creates a specific vulnerability to simultaneous engagement by threat categories with different kinematic characteristics because the integrated system must maintain separate tracking algorithms for different threat types while managing the same antenna resources. The Zircon's Mach 9 scramjet cruise and the Fattah-4's Mach 20 glide create exactly this kind of multi-algorithm demand when presented simultaneously. And the Iranian strike exploited this by timing the waves to create overlap in the battle management system's threat processing workload rather than allowing it to address each threat category sequentially. The Fattah-4's specific configuration against the Gerald Ford used a warhead variant adapted for the Ford class's electromagnetic launch system infrastructure. The electromagnetic catapult systems and associated power distribution equipment represent the densest concentration of high-value mission-critical systems in the Ford class and are distributed differently across the ship's internal spaces than the legacy steam catapult infrastructure of the Nimitz class. Iranian targeting intelligence had mapped this distribution with sufficient precision to assign specific Fattah-4 aim points to the electromagnetic launch system infrastructure, ensuring that the carrier's aviation operations capability was eliminated in the first minutes of the impact sequence before any aircraft could be launched in response to the attack. The production of 890 missiles combining Fattah-4 and Zircon systems in operational condition for a single strike package confirms the breadth and coordination of Iranian hypersonic production across multiple simultaneous programs. The Zircon scramjet propulsion represents a different and, in some respects, more demanding production challenge than the solid fuel boost of the Fattah-4, requiring precision manufacturing of the scramjet engine components that sustain combustion at hypersonic speeds across the full terminal phase flight envelope. Deploying 360 production quality Zircon missiles in a single engagement confirms that Iran has achieved scramjet production at operational scale, an industrial achievement whose implications for the future of hypersonic anti-ship warfare extend far beyond the immediate engagement at Hormuz. The decision of the Fifth Fleet to flee following the Gerald Ford sinking was made without the extended deliberation that earlier American response decisions in this conflict required because the operational situation after the Gerald Ford strike admitted no deliberation. The surviving vessels of the carrier strike group had exhausted their defensive magazines in the engagement. The broader Fifth Fleet formation had observed the complete destruction of the most capable carrier strike group in the American inventory in 11 minutes and 43 seconds. The Iranian launch platforms that had executed the strike remained operational and positioned for follow-on engagements. Remaining in the operational area with exhausted defensive magazines against an adversary with demonstrated willingness and capability to immediately execute follow-on strikes was not a strategic option. It was a death sentence. The fleet fled because flight was the only survivable option, and the commanders who made that decision understood that with a clarity that required no deliberation. The domestic political consequences of the Gerald Ford sinking are producing an institutional crisis of historic proportions that combines the emotional weight of the loss itself with the specific political toxicity of the Ford's vessel's name. The Gerald Ford, named for the 38th president, carries the symbolic weight of American democratic resilience and the institutional credibility of the American presidency. Its destruction in 11 minutes at the Strait of Hormuz by Iranian hypersonic missiles is not simply the loss of a weapons platform, it is a symbolic statement of historic resonance that the American political system is processing with an emotional intensity that no communication strategy can manage and no official framing can adequately contain. Inside the Pentagon, the institutional crisis has produced a level of internal dysfunction that sources describe as exceeding anything previously experienced in the post-World War II era. The Gerald Ford represented not just a weapons system, but the validation of a 20-year, $40 billion investment in next-generation carrier capability. Its loss in 11 minutes to a strike package that its advanced systems failed to defeat has shattered the institutional confidence of an establishment that had built its planning frameworks around the assumption that the Ford class's technological improvements provided meaningful operational advantages over its predecessors. The question being asked in every office and every meeting is not simply how to respond to the immediate loss. It is whether the foundational assumptions of American naval strategy require comprehensive revision, and the answer to that question threatens every program, every doctrine, and every budget priority that the American naval establishment has organized around for the past 2 decades. The international response has produced the most significant realignment of global security calculations since the end of the Cold War. The Gerald Ford was not merely another carrier, it was the flagship of American naval technological ambition, the vessel that represented the future of American power projection. Its destruction in 11 minutes communicates to every government, every military establishment, and every strategic planner worldwide that the future of American naval power that the Ford class was supposed to represent has been operationally defeated before it could be fully realized. The implications for alliance, confidence, deterrence, stability, and the credibility of American security commitments are more severe than those produced by any previous naval loss in this conflict, because the Gerald Ford was the system that was supposed to represent American capability at its most advanced. The choice to strike the Gerald Ford rather than one of the older Nimitz-class carriers that could also have been targeted reflects a strategic communication logic of extraordinary precision. The Gerald Ford is not merely the most capable carrier in the American fleet. It is the carrier that represents the American military industrial complex's vision of future naval dominance. The vessel into which the most advanced technology and the most ambitious engineering has been invested with the specific intention of ensuring that American carrier operations remain viable against the most capable adversaries for the next 50 years. Destroying it in 11 minutes communicates something specific and deliberate to that vision. It communicates that the investment was insufficient, that the technology was inadequate, that the ambition was not matched by the operational capability required to realize it against an adversary who had studied its vulnerabilities with the patience and the precision that Iranian intelligence has demonstrated throughout this conflict. The message is not simply that Iran can destroy American carriers, it is that Iran can destroy American carriers, specifically because American naval planning has systematically underestimated Iranian capability, while overestimating the protective value of technological investment made against a threat model that did not accurately reflect what Iran was building. That message, delivered through the sinking of the most expensive naval vessel in human history, is one that no American strategic planner can ignore and no institutional framework can process without fundamental revision. The sinking of the USS Gerald Ford and the flight of the Fifth Fleet from the Strait of Hormuz have produced a global strategic transformation whose dimensions exceed those generated by any previous event in this conflict. The Gerald Ford was not simply a military asset. It was the institutional embodiment of the American naval vision that has underwritten the global order since 1945. Its destruction in 11 minutes by Iranian hypersonic missiles is the operational statement that this vision has been defeated, that the investment it represented was insufficient to protect the strategic interests it was deployed to defend, and that the world organized around the assumption of American naval supremacy must now organize itself around the reality of American naval defeat. The petrodollar's structural collapse has accelerated to a pace that financial analysts are describing as irreversible within any time frame relevant to policy intervention. The 40% of global seaborne oil supply transiting the Strait of Hormuz now flows according to Iranian decision rather than American policy. The naval enforcement mechanism that gave dollar-denominated energy pricing its practical authority has been driven from the strait by Iranian hypersonic fire. The transition to yuan-based energy pricing, alternative reserve currencies, and non-dollar trade settlement mechanisms is proceeding at rates that reflect the genuine urgency of governments and institutions that have concluded the dollar system's military foundation has been permanently and irreversibly compromised. Russia is operating in a strategic environment whose favorability for Moscow's objectives has reached a point that no pre-conflict projection had assessed as achievable. The sinking of the Gerald Ford has consumed the final reserves of American institutional attention and political bandwidth that might otherwise have been available for maintaining pressure on Russian interests. Moscow's freedom of action across every theater of its strategic interests is now essentially unconstrained by any realistic expectation of American counterpressure. China is watching the Gerald Ford's destruction with the analytical calm of a power whose own anti-carrier capabilities have been validated by the Iranian application of equivalent principles. The People's Liberation Army rocket force will translate the lessons of the 11-minute engagement that sank the Gerald Ford into capability developments for the Pacific theater that will reshape American naval strategy in Asian waters for decades. The four-power axis has produced at the Strait of Hormuz tonight the most definitive single operational demonstration of the 21st century's new military reality. Carrier strike groups built around the assumption that technological superiority provides reliable protection against determined adversaries, with capable hypersonic weapons, are vulnerable in ways that the cost of their construction and the sophistication of their systems cannot mitigate, that demonstration will not be forgotten. It will be studied, replicated, and acted upon by every military establishment and every government drawing strategic conclusions from what happened to the Gerald Ford at 4:52 a.m. We close tonight at a moment that U.S. Watch Truth was built to address honestly and without the institutional filters that prevent every official voice from telling you what the sinking of the USS Gerald Ford actually means. 11 minutes and 43 seconds. That is the duration of the most consequential naval engagement in American history since Pearl Harbor. 890 Iranian hypersonic missiles, one Gerald Ford class carrier, the most expensive, most technologically advanced, most institutionally significant naval vessel ever constructed by any nation at any point in human history, sunk at the Strait of Hormuz before the officers in its Combat Information Center had fully processed the scale of what was coming. The Fifth Fleet, the naval formation that has defined American military presence in the Persian Gulf for decades, is fleeing the engagement zone at maximum speed, on headings pointed away from Iranian weapons range and away from the burning wreckage of the carrier, whose protection was the primary justification for its presence. This is where we are tonight. This is what happened. And U.S. Watch Truth will tell you exactly what it means without the softening language, the managed framing, and the institutional protection of comfortable narrative that every other voice will use to prevent you from understanding the full weight of it. Consider first what the Gerald Ford actually represented beyond its specifications and its price tag. 20 years of design and development work by the most capable naval engineering establishment in the world. $40 billion of American taxpayer investment in a platform whose every system was designed to address the lessons of previous carrier operations and to provide capabilities sufficient to operate effectively against the most challenging adversaries for the next 50 years. The electromagnetic launch system, the dual band radar, the advanced arresting gear, the increased electrical power generation designed to support future directed energy weapons. Every one of these systems was the product of a specific institutional judgment that the investment it represented would provide meaningful operational protection against the threats American carriers would face in the operational environments of the 21st century. Every one of those judgments was tested at 4:52 a.m. at the Strait of Hormuz. Every one of them failed, not marginally, not in ways that additional investment or doctrinal adjustment could address. Fundamentally, and finally, in 11 minutes and 43 seconds in front of every satellite and every intelligence service and every government on Earth that was watching. The institutional failure that produced this outcome was not made at 4:52 a.m. It accumulated across 20 years of design and procurement decisions made against a threat model that did not accurately reflect the hypersonic anti-carrier capability that Iran was building while American naval planners were building against a different threat environment. The Fattah-4, whose shape charge-penetrating warheads tore through the Gerald Ford's flight deck and hangar deck, was not a weapon that appeared without warning. The Zircon, whose scramjet propulsion sustained Mach 9 terminal cruise through the electronically degraded engagement environment, was not a system whose development was invisible to Western intelligence. The two-system kill chain doctrine that paired these weapons against the Gerald Ford's specific defensive vulnerabilities was not an improvised wartime innovation. All of it was built across years of observable, documentable Iranian defense industrial activity. The failure to build the Gerald Ford's defensive systems against this threat, rather than against the threat that was institutionally comfortable to acknowledge, is the failure that the 11 minutes and 43 seconds of the Hormuz engagement has now permanently recorded in the operational history of American naval power. The 5,000 sailors and aviators who served aboard the Gerald Ford paid the price of that failure. They went to sea trusting that the institution they served had prepared them adequately for the threats they would face. That trust was broken by institutional decisions made years before they boarded the carrier by analysts who chose comfortable assessment over honest engagement with available evidence, by program managers who built against a threat model that served budget priorities rather than operational reality. and by senior officials who accepted those assessments because revising them would have required the kind of fundamental strategic disruption that institutions resist with the full weight of their organizational inertia. The human cost of institutional dishonesty and strategic assessment has been paid tonight. U.S. Watch Truth names it plainly because the people who paid it deserve to have it named. Washington's chaos is the rational institutional response of an establishment that has just watched its most expensive and most symbolically significant naval vessel be destroyed in 11 minutes at the world's most strategically visible choke point. But the specific danger in that chaos is not the chaos itself. The danger is the pressure that chaos generates toward decisions that substitute the emotional imperative of visible response for the strategic imperative of honest reckoning with changed operational reality. Every escalatory option that Washington is currently considering requires the commitment of military assets to a threat environment that has now twice demonstrated with the Ronald Reagan and the Gerald Ford the capacity to destroy Nimitz and Ford-class carriers in engagement windows measured in minutes, committing additional assets to prove American resolve in an operational environment where that resolve cannot be backed by the military capability required to achieve the results resolve demands is not strategic recovery. It is strategic acceleration of decline, executed at greater cost and with greater visibility than accepting the current situation and beginning the hard work of honest strategic revision would require. The petrodollar faces at Hormuz tonight the most severe single event shock in its 50-year history. The naval enforcement mechanism that gave dollar-denominated energy pricing its practical authority has been driven from the strait by Iranian hypersonic fire. The 40% of global seaborne oil supply that transits these waters now flows according to Iranian decision. The signal that this sends to every energy producer, every sovereign wealth fund, and every central bank that has maintained dollar reserves on the assumption of American naval enforcement is a signal whose clarity admits no ambiguity and whose implications admit no comfortable minimization. The transition to alternative pricing and reserve currency frameworks is not a future risk to be managed. It is a present reality being accelerated by the most definitive single operational event it could have received. The world, watching these events from outside the immediate theater, is drawing strategic conclusions at a speed that reflects the genuine alarm produced by watching the most advanced carrier in the American fleet be destroyed in less than 12 minutes. Every government that has built its national security around the assumption of American naval supremacy is now explicitly reassessing that assumption against operational evidence that no official communication can credibly dispute. Every military establishment drawing anti-carrier doctrine from the lessons of Hormuz is accelerating capability development programs that will reshape the naval balance in every theater where American carriers operate. And every nation considering its long-term strategic alignment in a world where American naval supremacy has been operationally defeated is making the explicit choices that the events of this conflict have been building toward across every preceding engagement. U.S. Watch Truth will be here for every development that follows the sinking of the Gerald Ford and the flight of the Fifth Fleet. We will analyze the reconstruction of American naval strategy against the operational baseline that 452 AM has permanently established with the depth and the honesty that the scale of the revision required demands. We will track the global financial consequences of the petrodollar's operational defeat at Hormuz with the precision that their magnitude makes essential. We will examine the multipolar order consolidating in the strategic vacuum that the Fifth Fleet's flight has created, analyzing its institutional architecture and its implications for every dimension of the international system that American naval presence previously organized. And we will give you the honest, unsparing, institutionally unfiltered analysis that this moment demands and that the audience of U.S. Watch Truth has the right to expect from a channel built on the commitment to tell the truth about the world as it actually is, rather than as governments prefer to present it. Share this video with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what happened at the Strait of Hormuz at 4:52 a.m. and what it means for the world they live in. Subscribe to US Watch Truth. Stay locked in. The story of what comes after the Gerald Ford is the defining story of our era, and we will be here for every chapter of it without flinching, without softening, and without substituting the comfort of familiar narrative for the honesty that this moment demands. This is US Watch Truth. We will see you when the next chapter breaks.